Unit 13. Treatment of Psychological Disorders. Today we comprehend deep outer space and can state with certainty the chemical composition of Jupiter's atmosphere. But in understanding and treating the disturbances of deep inner space, the psychological disorders described in Unit 12, we are only beginning to make real progress. In the 2,200 years since Eratosthenes correctly estimated the Earth's circumference, we have charted the heavens, cracked the genetic code, and eliminated or found cures for all sorts of diseases. Meanwhile, we have treated psychological disorders with a bewildering array of harsh and gentle methods, by cutting holes in the head and by giving warm baths and massages, by restraining, bleeding, or beating the devil out of people, and by placing them in sunny, serene environments, by administering drugs and electric shocks, and by talking about childhood experiences, about current feelings, about maladaptive thoughts and behaviors. The transition from brutal to gentler treatments occurred thanks to the efforts of the reformers such as Philip Pinel in France and Dorothea Dix in the United States, Canada, and Scotland. Both advocated constructing mental hospitals to offer more humane methods of treatment, but times have once again changed, and the introduction of therapeutic drugs and community-based treatment programs has largely emptied mental health hospitals since the mid-1950s. Today's mental health therapies can be classified into two main categories, and the favored treatment depends on both the disorder and the therapist's viewpoint. Learning-related disorders, such as phobias, are likely candidates for psychotherapy, in which a trained therapist uses psychological techniques to assist someone seeking to overcome difficulties or achieve personal growth. Biologically influenced disorders, such as schizophrenia, will often be treated with biomedical therapy, a prescribed medication or medical procedure that acts directly on the patient's nervous system. Depending on the client and the problem, some therapists, particularly the many using a biopsychosocial approach, draw from a variety of techniques. Many patients receive drug therapy in combination with psychotherapy. Half of all psychotherapists describe themselves as taking an eclectic approach, using a blend of therapies. Psychotherapy integration attempts to combine a selection of assorted techniques into a single, coherent system. The psychological therapies. Among the dozens of types of psychotherapy, we will look at only the most influential. Each is built on one or more of psychology's major theories: psychoanalytic, humanistic, behavioral, and cognitive. Most of these techniques can be used one-on-one or in groups. Psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis was the first of the psychological therapies, and its terminology has crept into our modern vocabulary. Few clinicians today practice therapy as Freud did, but some of his techniques and assumptions survive, especially in the psychodynamic therapies. Aims. Because Freud assumed that many psychological problems are fueled by childhood's residue of repressed impulses and conflicts, he and his students sought to bring these repressed feelings into patients' conscious awareness. By gaining insight into the origins of the disorder, by excavating their childhood past and fulfilling the ancient imperative to know thyself in a deep way, patients then work through the buried feelings and take responsibility for their own growth. Psychoanalytic theory presumes that healthier, less anxious living becomes possible when people release the energy they had previously devoted to id-ego, superego conflicts. Methods. Psychoanalysis is historical reconstruction. Psychoanalytic theory emphasizes the formative power of childhood experiences, and thus aims to unearth the past in hope of unmasking the present. But how? After trying hypnosis and discarding it as unreliable, Freud turned to free association. Imagine yourself as a patient using free association. First, you relax, perhaps by lying on a couch. To help you focus on your own thoughts and feelings, the psychoanalyst may sit out of your line of vision. You say aloud whatever comes to your mind. At one moment, an early childhood memory. At another, a dream or recent experience. It sounds easy, but soon you notice how often you edit your thoughts as you speak, omitting what seems trivial, irrelevant, or shameful. Even in the safe presence of your analyst, you may pause momentarily before uttering an embarrassing thought. You may joke or change the subject to something less threatening. Sometimes your mind goes blank, or you find yourself unable to remember important details. To the psychoanalyst, these blocks in the flow of your free association indicate resistance. They hint that anxiety lurks and you are defending against sensitive material. The analyst will note your resistances and then interpret their meaning, providing insight into your underlying wishes, feelings, and conflicts. If offered at the right moment, this interpretation of, say, you're not wanting to talk about your mother may illuminate what you are avoiding and demonstrate how this resistance fits with other pieces of your psychological puzzle. Freud believed that another clue to conscious conflicts is your dream's latent content, their underlying but censored meaning. Thus, after inviting you to report a dream, the analyst must offer a dream analysis, suggesting its meaning. During many such sessions, you will probably disclose to your analyst more of yourself than you have ever revealed to anyone else, much of it pertaining to your earliest memories. You may find yourself experiencing strong, positive, or negative feelings for your analyst, who may suggest you are transferring to your analyst feelings you experience in earlier relationships with family members or other important people. By exposing feelings you have previously defended against, such as dependency or mingled love and anger, transference will give you a belated chance to work through them, with your analyst's help. Examining your feelings may also give you insight into your current relationships, not just those of early childhood. Psychoanalysts acknowledge the criticism that their interpretations cannot be proven or disproven, but they insist that interpretations often are a great help to patients. Psychoanalysis, they say, is therapy, not science. Traditional psychoanalysis takes time, up to several years of several sessions a week, and it is expensive. 3 times a week for just 2 years at more than $100 per hour comes to at least $30,000. Outside of France, Germany, Quebec, and New York City, relatively few therapists offer it. In the United States, at least, this is not surprising, given that U.S. managed healthcare limits the types and length of insured mental health services. Psychodynamic therapy. Influenced by Freud, psychodynamic therapists try to understand a patient's current symptoms by focusing on themes across important relationships, including childhood experiences and the therapist's relationship. They also help the person explore and gain perspective on defended against thoughts and feelings. But these therapists may talk to the patient face-to-face, rather than out of the patient's line of vision, once a week, rather than several times weekly, and for only a few weeks or months, rather than several years. No brief excerpt can exemplify the way psychodynamic therapy interprets a patient's conflict. But the following interaction between therapist David Milan and a depressed patient illustrates the goal of enabling insight by looking for common, recurring themes, especially in relationships. Milan: I get the feeling that you're the sort of person who needs to keep active. If you don't keep active, then something goes wrong. Is that true? Patient: yes. Milan: I get a second feeling about you, and that is that you must, underneath all of this, have an awful lot of very strong and upsetting feelings. Somehow they're there, but you aren't really quite in touch with them. Isn't this right? I feel you've been like that as long as you can remember. Patient: for quite a few years. Whenever I really sat down and thought about it, I got depressed, so I try not to think about it. Milan: you see, you've established a pattern, haven't you? You're even like that here with me. Because in spite of the fact that you're in some trouble and you feel that the bottom is falling out of your world, the way you're telling me this is just as if there wasn't anything wrong. Notice how Milan interpreted the woman's early remarks when she did most of the talking, and suggested that her relationship with him reveals a characteristic pattern of behavior. He was suggesting insights into her problems. Interpersonal therapy, a brief 12 to 16 session variation of psychodynamic therapy, has been effective in treating depression. Interpersonal psychotherapy aims to help people gain insight into the roots of their difficulties, but its goal is symptom relief in the here and now, not overall personality change. Rather than focusing mostly on undoing past hurts and offering interpretations, the therapist focuses primarily on current relationships and on helping people improve their relationship skills. The case of Anna, not her real name, a 34-year-old married professional, illustrates these goals. 5 months after receiving a promotion, with accompanying increased responsibilities and longer hours, Anna experienced increased tensions with her husband over his wish for a second child. She began feeling depressed, had trouble sleeping, became irritable, and was gaining weight. A typical psychodynamic therapist might have helped Anna gain insight into her angry impulses and her defenses against anger. An interpersonal therapist similarly wanted Anna to gain these insights, but also engaged her thinking on more immediate issues: how she could balance work and home, resolve the dispute with her husband, and express her emotions more effectively. Humanistic therapies. The humanistic perspective has emphasized people's inherent potential for self-fulfillment. Not surprisingly, humanistic therapists aim to boost self-fulfillment by helping people grow in self-awareness and self-acceptance. Like psychoanalytic therapies, humanistic therapies have attempted to reduce the inner conflicts that are impeding natural developmental growth by providing clients with new insights. Indeed, the psychoanalytic and humanistic therapies are often referred to as insight therapies. But humanistic therapists differ from psychoanalysts in focusing on 1. The present and future more than the past. They explore feelings as they occur, rather than achieving insights into the childhood origins of the feelings. 2. Conscious rather than unconscious thoughts. 3. Taking immediate responsibility for one's feelings and actions rather than uncovering hidden determinants. 4. Promoting growth instead of curing illness. Thus, those in therapy become clients rather than patients, a change many therapists have since adopted. Carl Rogers developed a widely used humanistic technique he called client-centered therapy, which focuses on the person's conscious self-perceptions. In this non-directive therapy, the therapist listens without judging or interpreting, and seeks to refrain from directing the client towards certain insights. Believing that most people already possess the resources for growth, Rogers encouraged therapists to exhibit genuineness, acceptance, and empathy. When therapists drop their facades and genuinely express their true feelings, when they enable their clients to feel unconditionally accepted, and when they empathetically sense and reflect their clients' feelings, the clients may deepen their self-understanding and self-acceptance. As Rogers explained, hearing has consequences. When I truly hear a person and the meanings that are important to him at that moment, hearing not simply his words, but him, and when I let him know that I have heard his own private personal meanings, many things happen. There is first of all a grateful look. He feels released. He wants to tell me more about his world. He surges forth in a new sense of freedom. He becomes more open to the process of change. I have often noticed that the more deeply I hear the meanings of the person, the more there is that happens. Almost always, when a person realizes he has been deeply heard, his eyes moisten. I think in some real sense he is weeping for joy. It is as though he were saying, "Thank God, somebody has heard me. Somebody knows what it's like to be me." Hearing refers to Rogers' technique of active listening, echoing, restating, and seeking clarification of what the person expresses, verbally or non-verbally, and acknowledging the expressed feelings. Active listening is now an accepted part of therapeutic counseling practices in many high schools, colleges, and clinics. The counselor listens attentively and interrupts only to restate and confirm feelings, to accept what is being expressed, or to seek clarification. The following brief excerpt between Rogers and a male client illustrates how he sought to provide a psychological mirror that would help clients see themselves more clearly. Rogers: feeling that now, That you're just no good to yourself, no good to anybody, never will be any good to anybody? Just that you're completely worthless, huh? Those really are lousy feelings. Just feel that you're no good at all. Client: yeah, muttering in low, discouraged voice. That's what this guy I went to town with just the other day told me. Rogers: this guy that you went to town with really told you that you were no good? Is that what you're saying? Did I get that right? Client: Rogers: I guess the meaning of that, if I get it right, is that here's somebody that meant something to you, and what does he think of you? Why, he's told you that he thinks you're no good at all. And that just really knocks the props out from under you. Client weeps quietly. It just brings the tears. Silence of 20 seconds. Client: I don't care though. Rogers: you tell yourself you don't care at all, but somehow I guess some part of you cares because some part of you weeps over it. Can a therapist be a perfect mirror without selecting and interpreting what is reflected? Rogers conceded that one cannot be totally non-directive. Nevertheless, he believed that the therapist's most important contribution is to accept and understand the client. Given a non-judgmental, grace-filled environment that provides unconditional positive regard, people may accept even their worst traits and feel valued and whole. If you want to listen more actively in your own relationships, 3 hints may help you. 1. Paraphrase. Rather than saying, I know how you feel, check your understandings by summarizing the speaker's words in your own words. 2. Invite clarification. What might be an example of that? May encourage the speaker to say more. 3. Reflect feelings. It sounds frustrating, might mirror what you're sensing from the speaker's body language and intensity. Behavior therapies. The insight therapies assume that many psychological problems diminish as self-awareness grows. Traditional psychoanalysts expect problems to subside as people gain insight into their unresolved and unconscious tensions. Humanistic therapists expect problems to diminish as people get in touch with their feelings. Proponents of behavior therapy, however, doubt the healing power of self-awareness. You can become aware of why you were highly anxious during the tests and still be anxious. They assume that problem behaviors are the problems, and the application of learning principles can eliminate them. Rather than delving deeply below the surface looking for inner causes, behavior therapists view maladaptive symptoms, such as phobias or other anxiety disorders, as learned behaviors that can be replaced by constructive behaviors. Classical conditioning techniques. One cluster of behavior therapies derives from principles developed in Ivan Pavlov's early 20th century conditioning experiments. As Pavlov and others showed, we learn various behaviors and emotions through classical conditioning. Could maladaptive symptoms be examples of conditioned responses? If so, might reconditioning be a solution? Learning theorist O. H. Maurer thought so and developed a successful conditioning therapy for chronic bedwetters. The child sleeps on a liquid-sensitive pad connected to an alarm. Moisture on the pad triggers the alarm, waking the child. With sufficient repetition, this association of urinary relaxation with waking up stops the bedwetting. In 3 out of 4 cases, the treatment is effective, and the success provides a boost to the child's self-image. Another example: if a claustrophobic fear of elevators is a learned aversion to the stimulus of being in a confined space, then might one unlearn that association by undergoing another round of conditioning to replace the fear response? Counter-conditioning pairs the trigger stimulus, in this case the enclosed space of the elevator, with a new response, relaxation, that is incompatible with fear. And indeed, behavior therapists have successfully counter-conditioned people with this fear. Two specific counter-conditioning techniques, exposure therapy and aversive conditioning, replace unwanted responses. Exposure therapies. Picture this scene reported in 1924 by behaviorist psychologist Mary Cover Jones. 3-year-old Peter is petrified of rabbits and other furry objects. Jones plans to replace Peter's fear of rabbits with a conditioned response incompatible with fear. Her strategy is to associate the fear-evoking rabbit with the pleasurable, relaxed response associated with eating. As Peter begins his mid-afternoon snack, Jones introduces a caged rabbit on the other side of the room. Peter, eagerly munching away on his crackers and drinking his milk, hardly notices. On succeeding days, she gradually moves the rabbit closer and closer. Within 2 months, Peter is tolerating the rabbit in his lap, even stroking it while he eats. Moreover, his fear of other furry objects subsides as well, having been countered or replaced by a relaxed state that cannot coexist with fear. Unfortunately, for those who might have been helped by her counter-conditioning procedures, Jones' story of Peter and the rabbit did not immediately become part of psychology's lore. It was more than 30 years later that psychiatrist Joseph Wolpe refined Jones' technique into what are now the most widely used types of behavior therapies, exposure therapies, which expose people to what they normally avoid. As people can habituate to the sound of planes passing over their new homes, so, with repeated exposure, can they become less anxiously responsive to things that once petrified them. One widely used exposure therapy is systematic desensitization. Wolpe assumed, as did Jones, that you cannot be simultaneously anxious and relaxed. Therefore, if you can repeatedly relax while facing anxiety-provoking stimuli, you can gradually eliminate your anxiety. The trick is to proceed gradually. Let's see how this might work with a common phobia. Imagine yourself afraid of public speaking. A behavior therapist might first ask for your help in constructing a hierarchy of anxiety-triggering speaking situations. Yours might range from mildly anxiety-provoking situations, perhaps speaking up in a small group of friends, to panic-provoking situations, such as having to address a large audience. Next, using progressive relaxation, the therapist would train you to relax one muscle group after another until you achieve a drowsy state of complete relaxation and comfort. Then the therapist would ask you to imagine, with your eyes closed, a mildly anxiety-arousing situation. You are at lunch with a group of friends and are trying to decide whether to speak up. If imagining the scene causes you to feel any anxiety, you would signal your tension by raising your finger, and the therapist would instruct you to switch off the mental image and go back to deep relaxation. This imagined scene is repeatedly paired with relaxation until you feel no trace of anxiety. The therapist would progress up the constructed anxiety hierarchy, using the relaxed state to desensitize you to each imagined situation. After several sessions, you move to actual situations and practice what you had only imagined before. Beginning with relatively easy tasks and gradually moving to more anxiety-filled ones. Conquering your anxiety in an actual situation, not just in your imagination, raises your self-confidence. Eventually, you may even become a confident public speaker. When an anxiety-arousing situation is too expensive, difficult, or embarrassing to recreate, virtual reality exposure therapy offers an efficient middle ground. Wearing a head-mounted display unit that projects a three-dimensional virtual world, you would view a lifelike series of scenes. As your head turns, motion sensors would adjust the scene. Experiments led by several research teams have treated many different people with many different fears: flying, heights, particular animals, and public speaking. People who fear flying, for example, can peer out a virtual window of a simulated plane, feel vibrations, and hear the engine roar as the plane taxis down the runway and takes off. The initial experiments, those experiencing virtual reality exposure therapy have had greater relief from their fears in real life than those in the control groups. Developments in virtual reality therapy suggest the possibility of designing simulated worlds in which patients create an avatar, a computer representation of oneself, through which they can try out new behaviors in virtual environments. For example, someone with a social phobia might visit a virtual party or group discussion, which others can join over time. Aversive conditioning. In systematic desensitization, the goal is substituting a positive, relaxed response for a negative, fearful response to a harmless stimulus. In aversive conditioning, the goal is substituting a negative, aversive response for a positive response to a harmful stimulus, such as alcohol. Thus, aversive conditioning is the reverse of systematic desensitization. It seeks to condition an aversion to something the person should avoid. The procedure is simple. It associates the unwanted behavior with unpleasant feelings. To treat nail biting, one can paint the fingernails with a nasty-tasting nail polish. To treat alcohol dependency, an aversion therapist offers a client appealing drinks laced with a drug that produces severe nausea. By linking alcohol with violent nausea, recall the taste aversion experiments with rats and coyotes in Unit 6, the therapist seeks to transform the person's reaction to alcohol from positive to negative. Does aversive conditioning work? In the short run, it may. Arthur Wiens and Carol Manustik studied 685 patients with alcohol dependency who completed an aversion therapy program at a Portland, Oregon hospital. 1 year later, after returning for several booster treatments of alcohol sickness pairing, 63% were successfully abstaining. But after 3 years, only 33% had remained abstinent. The problem, as we saw in Unit 6, is that cognition influences conditioning. People know that outside the therapist's office, they can drink without fear of nausea. Their ability to discriminate between the aversive conditioning situation and all other situations can limit the treatment's effectiveness. Thus, therapists often use aversive conditioning in combination with other treatments. Operant conditioning. A basic concept in operant conditioning is that voluntary behaviors are strongly influenced by their consequences. Knowing this, behavior therapists can practice behavior modification, reinforcing desired behaviors, and withholding reinforcement or enacting punishment for undesired behaviors. Using operant conditioning to solve specific behavior problems has raised hopes for some otherwise hopeless cases. Children with an intellectual disability have been taught to care for themselves. Socially withdrawn children with autism have learned to interact. People with schizophrenia have been helped to behave more rationally in their hospital ward. In such cases, therapists use positive reinforcers to shape behavior in a step-by-step manner, rewarding closer and closer approximations of the desired behavior. In extreme cases, treatment must be intensive. In one study, researchers worked with 19 withdrawn, uncommunicative 3-year-olds with autism. Each participated in a 2-year program in which their parents spent 40 hours a week attempting to shape their behavior. The combination of positively reinforcing desired behaviors and ignoring or punishing aggressive and self-abusive behaviors worked wonders for some. By first grade, 9 of the 19 children are functioning successfully in school and exhibiting normal intelligence. In a group of 40 comparable children not undergoing this treatment, which involves sustained effort, only 1 showed similar improvement. Rewards used to modify behavior vary. For some people, the reinforcing power of attention or praise is sufficient. Others require concrete rewards, such as food. In institutional settings, therapists may create a token economy. When people display appropriate behavior, such as getting out of bed, washing, dressing, eating, talking coherently, cleaning up their rooms, or playing cooperatively, they receive a token or plastic coin as a positive reinforcer. Later, they can exchange their accumulated tokens for various rewards, such as candy, TV time, trips to town, or better living quarters. Token economies have been successfully applied in various settings: homes, classrooms, hospitals, institutions for the delinquent, and among members of various populations, including disturbed children and people with schizophrenia and other mental disabilities. Critics of behavior modification express two concerns. The first is practical. How durable are the behaviors? Will people become so dependent on extrinsic rewards that the appropriate behaviors will stop when the reinforcers stop, as may happen when they leave the institution? Proponents of behavior modification believe the behaviors will endure if therapists wean patients from the tokens by shifting them towards other rewards, such as social approval, more typical of life outside the institution. They also point out that the appropriate behaviors themselves can be intrinsically rewarding. For example, a withdrawn person becomes more socially competent. As a withdrawn person becomes more socially competent, the intrinsic satisfactions of social interaction may help the person maintain the behavior. The second concern is ethical. Is it right for one human to control another's behavior? Those who set up token economies deprive people of something they desire and decide which behaviors to reinforce. To critics, this whole process has an authoritarian taint. Advocates reply that some patients request the therapy. Moreover, control already exists. Rewards and punishers are already maintaining destructive behavior patterns. So why not reinforce adaptive behavior instead? Treatment with positive rewards is more humane than being institutionalized or punished, they argue, and the right to effective treatment and improved life justifies temporary deprivation. Cognitive therapies. We have seen how behavior therapists treat specific fears and problem behaviors. But how do they deal with major depression or with generalized anxiety, in which anxiety has no focus and developing a hierarchy of anxiety-triggered situations is difficult? Behavior therapists treating these less clearly defined psychological problems have had help with the same cognitive revolution that has profoundly changed other areas of psychology during the last 5 decades. The cognitive therapies assume that our thinking colors our feelings. Between the event and our response lies the mind. Self-blaming and overgeneralized explanations of bad events are often the integral part of the vicious cycle of depression. The depressed person interprets a suggestion as criticism, disagreement as dislike, praise as flattery, friendliness as pity. Ruminating on such thoughts sustains the negative thinking. If such thinking patterns can be learned, then surely they can be replaced. Cognitive therapists therefore try in various ways to teach people new, more constructive ways of thinking. If people are miserable, they can be helped to change their minds. Beck's theory of depression. Cognitive therapist Aaron Beck was originally trained in Freudian techniques. As Beck analyzed the dreams of depressed people, he found recurring negative themes of loss, rejection, and abandonment that extended into their waking thoughts. Such negativity even extends into therapy, as clients recall and rehearse their failings and worst impulses. With cognitive therapy, Beck and his colleagues have sought to reverse client catastrophizing beliefs about themselves, their situations, and their futures. Gentle questioning seeks to reveal irrational thinking, and then to persuade people to remove the dark glasses through which they review life. Client. I agree with the descriptions of me, but I guess I don't agree that the way I think makes me depressed. Beck. How do you understand it? Client. I get depressed when things go wrong, like when I fail a test. Beck. How can failing a test make you depressed? Client. Well, if I fail, I'll never get into law school. Beck. So failing the test means a lot to you. But if failing a test could drive people into clinical depression, wouldn't you expect everyone who failed a test to have depression? Did everyone who failed get depressed enough to require treatment? No. Client. No, but it depends on how important the test was to the person. Beck. Right. And who decides the importance? Client. I do. Beck. And so, what we have to examine is your way of viewing the test, or the way you think about the test, and how it affects your chances of getting into law school. Do you agree? Client. Right. Beck. Do you agree that the way you interpret the results of the test will affect you? You might feel depressed. You might have trouble sleeping. Do not feel like eating. And you might even wonder if you should drop out of the course. Client. I have been thinking that I wasn't going to make it. Yes, I agree. Beck. Now what did failing mean? Client. That I couldn't get into law school? Beck. And what does that mean to you? Client. That I'm just not smart enough. Beck. Anything else? Client. That I can never be happy. Beck. And how do these thoughts make you feel? Client. Very unhappy. Beck. So it is the meaning of failing a test that makes you very unhappy. In fact, believing that you can never be happy is a powerful factor in producing unhappiness. So, you get yourself into a trap. By definition, failure to get into law school equals I can never be happy. We often think in words. Therefore, getting people to change what they say to themselves is an effective way to change their thinking. Perhaps you can identify with the anxious students who, before a test, make matters worse with self-defeating thoughts. This test's probably going to be impossible. All these other students seem so relaxed and confident. I wish I were better prepared. Anyhow, I'm so nervous I'll forget everything. To change such negative talk, Donald Meichenbaum has offered stress inoculation training, teaching people to restructure their thinking in stressful situations. Sometimes it may be enough simply to say more positive things to oneself. Relax. This test may be hard, but it will be hard for everyone else too. I studied harder than most people. Besides, I don't need a perfect score to get a good grade. After being trained to dispute their negative thoughts, depression-prone children, teens, and college students exhibit a greatly reduced rate of future depression. To a large extent, it is the thought that counts. Cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, a widely practiced integrative therapy, aims not only to alter the way people think, cognitive therapy, but also to alter the way they act, behavior therapy. It seeks to make people aware of their irrational negative thinking, to replace it with the new ways of thinking, and to practice the more positive approach in everyday settings. Anxiety and mood disorders share a common problem: emotion regulation. An effective treatment program for these emotional disorders trains people both to replace their catastrophizing thinking with more realistic appraisals and to practice behaviors that are incompatible with their problem. A person with a fear of social situations, for example, might learn new ways of thinking, but also practice approaching people. In one study, people learned to prevent compulsive behaviors by relabeling their obsessive thoughts. Feeling the urge to wash their hands again, they would tell themselves, "I'm having a compulsive urge," and attribute it to their brain's abnormal activity, as previously viewed in their PET scans. Instead of giving in to the urge, they would then spend 15 minutes in an enjoyable alternative behavior, such as practicing an instrument, taking a walk, or gardening. This helped unstick the brain by shifting attention and engaging other brain areas. For 2 or 3 months, the weekly therapy sessions continued, with relabeling and refocusing practice at home. By the study's end, most participants' symptoms had diminished and their PET scans revealed normalized brain activity. Many other studies confirm cognitive behavioral therapy's effectiveness for those suffering anxiety or depression. Group and family therapies. Except for the traditional psychoanalysis, most therapies may also occur in small groups. Group therapy does not provide the same degree of therapist involvement with each client. However, it saves therapists time and clients money, and it often is no less effective than individual therapy. Therapists frequently suggest group therapy for people experiencing family conflicts or for those whose behavior is distressing to others. For up to 90 minutes a week, the therapist guides the interactions of a group of people as they engage issues and react to one another. Group sessions also offer a unique benefit. The social context allows people both to discover that others have problems similar to their own and to receive feedback as they try out new ways of behaving. It can be a relief to find that you are not alone, to learn that others, despite their apparent composure, share your problems and your troublesome feelings. It can also be reassuring to hear that you yourself look poised even though you feel anxious and self-conscious. One special type of group interaction, family therapy, assumes that no person is an island, that we live and grow in relation to others, especially our families. We struggle to differentiate ourselves from our families, but we also need to connect with them emotionally. Some of our problem behaviors arise from the tension between these two tendencies, which can create family stress. Unlike most psychotherapy, which focuses on what happens inside the person's own skin, family therapists work with family members to heal relationships and to mobilize family resources. They tend to view the family as a system in which each person's actions trigger reactions from others, and they help family members discover their role within their family's social system. A child's rebellion, for example, affects and is affected by other family tensions. Therapists also attempt, usually with some success, research suggests, to open up communication within the family or to help family members discover new ways of preventing or resolving conflicts. A wide range of people participate in self-help and support groups. One analysis of online support groups and more than 14,000 self-help groups report that most support groups focus on stigmatized and hard-to-discuss illnesses. AIDS patients are 250 times more likely than hypertension patients to be in support groups. Those struggling with anorexia and alcohol dependency often join groups. Those with migraines and ulcers do not. People with hearing loss have national organizations with local chapters. People with vision loss more often cope without such groups. The grandparent of support groups, Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, reports having more than 2 million members in 114,000 groups worldwide. Its famous 12-step program, emulated by many other self-help groups, asks members to admit their powerlessness, to seek help from a higher power and from one another, and the 12th step, to take the message to others in need of it. In one 8-year, $27 million investigation, AA participants reduced their drinking sharply, although so did those assigned to cognitive behavioral therapy or to motivational therapy. Other studies have similarly found that 12-step programs such as AA have helped reduce alcohol dependence comparably to other treatment interventions. The more meetings patients attend, the greater their alcohol abstinence. In one study of 2,300 veterans who sought treatment for alcohol dependency, a high level of AA involvement was followed by diminished alcohol problems. In an individualistic age, with more and more people living alone or feeling isolated, the popularity of support groups for the addicted, the bereaved, the divorced, or simply those seeking fellowship and growth seems to reflect a longing for community and connectedness. More than 100 million Americans belong to small religious interest or self-help groups that meet regularly, and 9 in 10 report that group members support each other emotionally. For a synopsis of the main forms of psychotherapy we've been discussing, see Table 13.1. Evaluating psychotherapies. Advice columnists frequently urge their troubled letter writers to get professional help. Don't give up. Find a therapist who can help you. Make an appointment. Therapists can verify that many Americans share this confidence in psychotherapy's effectiveness. Before 1950, psychiatrists were the primary providers of mental health care. Today, surging demands for psychotherapy mean that people are also seeking help from clinical and counseling psychologists, clinical social workers, pastoral, marital, abuse, and school counselors, and psychiatric nurses. In 2004, for example, 7.4% of Americans reported undergoing counseling for mental or emotional problems, a 25% increase since 1991. With such an enormous outlay of time as well as money, effort, and hope, it is important to ask, are the millions of people worldwide justified in placing such hope in psychotherapy? Is psychotherapy effective? The question, though simply put, is not simply answered. Measuring therapy's effectiveness is not like taking your body's temperature to see if your fever has gone away. If you and I were to undergo psychotherapy, how would we assess its effectiveness? By how we feel about our progress? How our therapist feels about it? How our friends and family feel about it? How our behavior has changed? Clients' perceptions. If clients' testimonials were the only measuring stick, we could strongly affirm the effectiveness of psychotherapy. When 2,900 Consumer Reports readers related their experiences with mental health professionals, 89% said they were at least fairly well satisfied. Among those who recalled feeling fair or very poor when beginning therapy, 9 in 10 now were feeling very good, or at least so-so. We have their word for it, and who should know better? We should not dismiss these testimonials lightly, but for several reasons, client testimonials do not persuade psychotherapy skeptics. 1. People often enter therapy in crisis. When, with the normal ebb and flow of events, the crisis passes, people may attribute their improvement to the therapy. 2. Clients may need to believe the therapy was worth the effort. To admit investing time and money in something ineffective is like admitting to having one's car serviced repeatedly by a mechanic who never fixes it. Self-justification is a powerful human motive. 3. Clients generally speak kindly of their therapists. Even if the problem remains, says the critics, clients work hard to find something positive to say. The therapist had been very understanding. The client had gained a new perspective. He learned to communicate better. His mind was eased, anything at all, so as not to have to say treatment was a failure. As earlier units document, we are prone to selective and biased recall and to making judgments that confirm our beliefs. Consider the testimonials gathered in a massive experiment with over 500 Massachusetts boys, aged 15 to 13, many of whom seemed bound for delinquency. By the toss of a coin, half the boys were assigned to a 5-year treatment program. The treated boys were visited by counselors twice a month. They participated in community programs, and they received academic tutoring, medical attention, and family assistance when needed. Some 30 years later, Joanne McCord located 485 participants, then sent them questionnaires, and checked public records from courts, mental hospitals, and other sources. Was the treatment successful? Client testimonials yielded encouraging results, even glowing reports. Some men noted that, had it not been for their counselors, I would probably be in jail. My life would have gone the other way, or I think I would have ended up in a life of crime. Court records offered apparent support, even among the difficult boys in the treatment group. 66% had no official juvenile crime record. But recall psychology's most powerful tool for sorting reality from wishful thinking, the control group. For every boy in the treatment group, there was a similar boy in a control group receiving no counseling. Of these untreated men, 70% had no juvenile record. On several other measures, such as record of having committed a second crime, alcohol dependence, death rate, and job satisfaction, the untreated men exhibited slightly fewer problems. The glowing testimonials of those treated had been unintentionally deceiving. Clinicians' perceptions. Do clinicians' perceptions give us any more reason to elaborate? Case studies of successful treatment abound. The problem is that clients justify entering psychotherapy by emphasizing their unhappiness, justify leaving by emphasizing their well-being, and stay in touch only if satisfied. Therapists treasure compliments from clients as they say goodbye or later express their gratitude. But they hear little from clients who experience only temporary relief and seek out new therapists for their recurring problems. Thus, the same person, with the same recurring anxieties, depression, or marital difficulty, may be a success story in several therapists' files. Because most people enter therapy when they are extremely unhappy and usually leave when they're less extremely unhappy, most therapists, like most clients, testify to therapy's success, regardless of the treatment. Outcome research. How, then, can we objectively measure the effectiveness of psychotherapy if neither clients nor clinicians can tell us? How can we determine what types of people and problems are best helped, and by what type of psychotherapy? In search of answers, psychologists have turned to controlled research studies. Similar research in the 1800s transformed the field of medicine. Physicians, skeptical of many of the fashionable treatments, bleeding, purging, infusions of plant and metal substances, began to realize that many patients got better on their own, without these treatments, and that others died in spite of them. Sorting fact from superstition required following patients with and without a particular treatment. Typhoid fever patients, for example, often improved after being bled, convincing most physicians that the treatment worked. Not until a control group was given mere bed rest, and 70% were observed to improve after 5 weeks of fever, did physicians learn, to their shock, that the bleeding was worthless. In psychology, the opening challenge to the effectiveness of psychotherapy was issued by British psychologist Hans Eysenck. Launching a spirited debate, he summarized studies showing that 2/3 of those receiving psychotherapy for non-psychotic disorders improved markedly. To this day, no one disputes that optimistic estimate. Why, then, are we still debating psychotherapy's effectiveness? Because Eysenck also reported similar improvement among untreated persons, such as those who were on waiting lists. With or without psychotherapy, he said, roughly 2/3 improved noticeably. Time was a great healer. Later research revealed shortcomings in Eysenck's analyses. His sample was small, only 24 studies of psychotherapy outcomes in 1952. Today, hundreds of studies are available. The best are randomized clinical trials, in which researchers randomly assign people on waiting lists to therapy or to no therapy, and later evaluate everyone, using tests and the reports of people who don't know whether therapy was given. The results of many such studies are then digested by means of meta-analysis, a statistical procedure that combines the conclusions of a large number of different studies. Simply said, meta-analyses give us the bottom line results of lots of studies. Psychotherapists welcome the first meta-analysis of some 475 psychotherapy outcome studies. It showed that the average therapy client ends up better off than 80% of the untreated individuals on waiting lists. The claim is modest, by definition. About 50% of untreated people also are better off than the average untreated person. Nevertheless, Mary Lee Smith and her colleagues exulted that psychotherapy benefits people of all ages as reliably as schooling educates them, medicine cures them, and business turns a profit. More than 6 subsequent summaries have now examined this question. Their verdict echoes the results of the earlier outcome studies. Those not undergoing therapy often improve, but those undergoing therapy are more likely to improve. Is psychotherapy also cost-effective? Again, the answer is yes. Studies show that when people seek psychological treatment, their search for other medical treatment drops by 16% in one digest of 91 studies. Given the staggering annual costs of psychological disorders and substance abuse, crime, accidents, lost work, and treatment, psychotherapy seems to be a good investment, much like money spent on prenatal and well baby care. Both reduce long-term costs. Boosting employees' psychological well-being, for example, can lower medical costs, improve work efficiency, and diminish absenteeism. But note that the claim that psychotherapy, on average, is somewhat effective refers to no one therapy in particular. It is like reassuring lung cancer patients that, on average, medical treatment of health problems is effective. What people want to know is the effectiveness of a particular treatment for their specific problems. The relative effectiveness of different therapies. So what can we tell people considering therapy and those paying for it about which psychotherapy will be most effective for their problem? The statistical summaries and surveys fail to pinpoint any one type of therapy as generally superior. Clients seemed equally satisfied, Consumer Reports concluded, whether treated by a psychiatrist, psychologist, or social worker, whether seen in a group or individual context, whether the therapist had extensive or relatively limited training and experience. Other studies concur. There is little, if any, connection between clinicians' experience, training, supervision, and licensing, and their clients' outcomes. So was the dodo bird in Alice in Wonderland right? Everyone has one, and all must have prizes. Not quite right. Some forms of therapy get prizes for particular problems. Behavioral conditioning therapies, for example, have achieved especially favorable results with specific behavior problems, such as bedwetting, phobias, compulsions, and marital problems. And new studies confirm cognitive therapy's effectiveness in coping with depression and reducing suicide risk. Moreover, we can say that therapy is most effective when the problem is clear-cut. Those who experience phobias or panic, who are unassertive, or who seek more family harmony can hope for improvement. Those with less focused problems, such as depression and anxiety, usually benefit in the short term but often relapse later. And those with the negative symptoms of chronic schizophrenia or a desire to change their entire personality are unlikely to benefit from psychotherapy alone. The more specific the problem, the greater the hope. But no prizes, and little or no scientific support, go to other therapies. We would all therefore be wise to avoid the following unsupported approaches. 1. Energy therapies propose to manipulate people's invisible energy fields. 2. Recovered memory therapies aim to unearth repressed memories of early childhood abuse. 3. Rebirthing therapies engage people in reenacting the supposed trauma of their birth. 4. Facilitated communication has an assistant touch the typing hand of a child with autism. And 5. Crisis debriefing forces people to verbalize, rehearse, and process their traumatic experiences. But this question, which therapies get prizes and which do not, lies at the heart of a serious controversy some call psychology's civil war. To what extent should science guide both clinical practice and the willingness of healthcare providers and insurers to pay for psychotherapy? On the one side are research psychologists using scientific methods to extend the list of well-defined and validated therapies for various disorders. On the other side are non-scientist therapists who view their practice as more art than science, saying that people are too complex and therapy too intuitive to describe in a manual or test in an experiment. Between these two factions stand the science-oriented clinicians, who believe that by basing practice on evidence and making mental health professionals accountable for effectiveness, therapy will only gain in credibility. Moreover, the public will be protected from pseudotherapies, and therapists will be protected from accusations of sounding like snake oil salesmen. Trust me, I know it works. I've seen it work. To encourage evidence-based practice in psychology, the American Psychological Association has followed the Institute of Medicine's lead, advocating that clinicians integrate the best available research with clinical expertise and patient preferences and characteristics. Available therapies should be rigorously evaluated, and then applied by clinicians who are mindful of their skills and of each patient's unique situation. Increasingly, insurer and government support for mental health services require evidence-based practice. In late 2007, for example, Britain's National Health Service announced that it would pour the equivalent of $600 million into training new mental health workers in evidence-based practices, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, and to disseminating information about such treatments. Evaluating alternative therapies. The tendency of many abnormal states of mind to return to normal, combined with the placebo effect, creates a fertile soil for pseudotherapies. Bolstered by anecdotes, heralded by media, and praised on the internet, alternative therapies can spread like wildfire. In one national survey, 57% of those with a history of anxiety attacks and 54% of those with a history of depression had used alternative treatments, such as herbal medicine, massage, and spiritual healing. Testimonials aside, what does the evidence say about alternative therapies? This is a tough question, because there is no evidence for or against most of them. Though their proponents often feel personal experience is evidence enough, some, however, have been the subject of controlled research. Let's consider two of them. As we do, remember that sifting sense from nonsense requires the scientific attitude, being skeptical but not cynical, open to surprises but not gullible. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, is a therapy adored by thousands and dismissed by thousands more as a sham. An excellent vehicle for illustrating the differences between scientific and pseudoscientific therapy techniques, suggested James Herbert and 7 others. Francine Shapiro developed EMDR one day while walking in a park and observing that anxious thoughts vanished as her eyes spontaneously darted about. Offering her novel anxiety treatment to others, she had people imagine traumatic scenes while she triggered eye movements by waving her fingers in front of their eyes, supposedly enabling them to unlock and reprocess previously frozen memories. After she tried this on 22 people haunted by old traumatic memories, and all reported marked reductions in their distress after just one therapeutic session, the extraordinary result evoked an enormous response from mental health professionals. To date, nearly 70,000 of them, from more than 75 countries, have undergone training. Not since the similarly charismatic Franz Anton Mesmer introduced animal magnetism, hypnosis, more than 2 centuries ago, also after feeling inspired by an outdoor experience, has a new therapy attracted so many devotees so quickly? Does it work? For 84 to 100% of single trauma victims participating in 4 studies, the answer was yes, reported Shapiro. When EMDR did not fare well in other trials, Shapiro argued that the therapists were not properly trained. Moreover, the treatment need take no more than 3 90-minute sessions. The Society of Clinical Psychology Task Force on Empirically Validated Treatments acknowledges that the treatment is probably efficacious for the treatment of non-military post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Encouraged by their seeming successes, EMDR therapists are now applying the technique to other anxiety disorders, such as panic disorder, and, with Shapiro's encouragement, to a wide range of complaints, including pain, grief, paranoid schizophrenia, rage, and guilt. Why, wonder the skeptics, would rapidly moving one's eye while recalling traumas be therapeutic? Indeed, it seems eye movements are not therapeutic ingredients. In trials in which people imagined traumatic scenes and tapped a finger, or just stared straight ahead while the therapist's finger wagged, the therapeutic results were the same. EMDR does work better than doing nothing, acknowledge the skeptics. But many suspect that what is therapeutic is the combination of exposure therapy, repeatedly associating with traumatic memories a safe and reassuring context that provides some emotional distance from the experience, and a robust placebo effect. Had Mesmer's pseudotherapy been compared with no treatment at all, it too, thanks to the healing power of positive belief, might have been found probably efficacious, observed Richard McNally. Light exposure therapy. Have you ever found yourself oversleeping, gaining weight, and feeling lethargic during the dark mornings and overcast days of winter? There likely was a survival advantage to your distant ancestors, slowing down and conserving energy during the dark days of winter. For some people, however, especially women and those living far from the equator, the wintertime blahs constitute a form of depression known as seasonal affective disorder, for which the appropriate acronym is SAD. To counteract these dark spirits, National Institute of Mental Health researchers in the early 1980s had an idea. Give sad people a timed daily dose of intense light. Sure enough, people reported they feel better. Was this a bright idea, or another dim-witted example of the placebo effect? Attributable to people's expectations? Recent studies shed some light. One exposed some people with SAD to 90 minutes of bright light, and others to a sham placebo treatment, a hissing negative ion generator, about which the staff expressed similar enthusiasm, but which, unknown to the participants, was not turned on. After 4 weeks of treatment, 61% of those exposed to morning light had greatly improved, as had 50% of those exposed to evening. Other studies have found that 30 minutes of exposure to 10,000 lux white fluorescent light produced relief for more than half the people receiving morning light therapy and for 1/3 receiving evening light therapy. From 20 carefully controlled trials, we have a verdict. Morning bright light does indeed dim SAD symptoms for many people. Moreover, it does so as effectively as taking antidepressant drugs or as undergoing cognitive behavioral therapy. The effects are clear in brain scans. This therapy sparks activity in a brain region that influences the body's arousal and hormones. Commonalities among psychotherapies. The scientific attitude helps us sift sense from nonsense as we consider new forms of therapy. Might it also help explain why studies have found little correlation between therapists' training and experience and clients' outcomes? In search of some answers, Jerome Frank, Marvin Goldfried, Hans Stroop, and Bruce Wampold have studied the common ingredients of various therapies. This suggests they all offer at least 3 benefits: hope for demoralized people, a new perspective on oneself and the world, and an empathetic, trusting, caring relationship. Hope for demoralized people. People seeking therapy typically feel anxious, depressed, devoid of self-esteem, and incapable of turning things around. What any therapy offers is the expectation that, with commitment from the therapy seeker, things can and will get better. This belief, apart from any therapeutic technique, may function as a placebo, improving morale, creating feelings of self-efficacy, and diminishing symptoms. Statistical analyses show that improvement is greater for placebo-treated people than for untreated people, suggest that one way therapies help is by harnessing the client's own healing powers. And that, says the psychologist Jerome Frank, helps us understand why all sorts of treatments, including some folk healing rites that are powerless apart from the participant's belief, may in their own time and place produce cures. A new perspective. Every therapy also offers people a plausible explanation of their symptoms and an alternative way of looking at themselves or responding to their world. Armed with a believable, fresh perspective, they may approach life with a new attitude, open to making changes in their behavior and their views of themselves. An empathetic, trusting, caring relationship. To say that therapy outcome is unrelated to training and experience is not to say all therapists are equally effective. No matter what therapeutic technique they use, effective therapists are empathetic people who seek to understand another's experience, who communicate their care and concern to the client, and who earn the client's trust and respect through respectful listening, reassurance, and advice. Marvin Goldfried and his associates found these qualities in taped therapy sessions from 36 recognized master therapists. Some were cognitive behavioral therapists, others were psychodynamic interpersonal therapists. Regardless, the striking finding was how similar they were during the parts of their sessions they considered most significant. At key moments, the empathetic therapists of both persuasions would help clients evaluate themselves, link one aspect of their life with another, and gain insight into their interactions with others. The emotional bond between therapist and client, the therapeutic alliance, is a key aspect of effective therapy. One U.S. National Institute of Mental Health depression treatment study confirmed the most effective therapists were those who were perceived as most empathetic and caring and who established the closest therapeutic bonds with their clients. That all therapies offer hope through a fresh perspective offered by a caring person is what also enables paraprofessionals, briefly trained caregivers, to assist so many troubled people so effectively. These three common elements are also part of what the growing numbers of self-help and support groups offer their members. And they are part of what traditional healers have offered. Healers everywhere, special people to whom others disclose their suffering, whether psychiatrists, witch doctors, or shamans, have listened in order to understand and to empathize, reassure, advise, console, interpret, or explain. Such qualities may explain why people who feel supported by close relationships, who enjoy the fellowship and the friendship of caring people, are less likely to need or seek therapy. To recap, people who seek help usually improve. So do many of those who do not undergo psychotherapy, and that is a tribute to our human resourcefulness and our capacity to care for one another. Nevertheless, though the therapist's orientation and experience may appear not to matter much, people who receive some psychotherapy usually improve more than those who do not. People with clear-cut, specific problems tend to improve the most. Culture and values in psychotherapy. All therapies offer hope, and nearly all therapists attempt to enhance their clients' sensitivity, openness, personal responsibility, and sense of purpose. But in matters of cultural and moral diversity, therapists differ from one another and may differ from their clients. These differences can become significant when a therapist from one culture meets a client from another. In North America, Europe, and Australia, for example, most therapists reflect their culture's individualism, which often gives priority to personal desires and identity. Clients who are immigrants from Asian countries, where people are mindful of others' expectations, may have trouble relating to therapists that require them to think only of their own well-being. Such differences help explain some minority populations' reluctance to use mental health services and to prematurely terminate therapy. In one experiment, Asian American clients matched with counselors who shared their cultural values, rather than mismatched with those who did not, perceived more counselor empathy and felt a stronger alliance with the counselor. Recognizing that therapists and clients may differ in their values, communication styles, and language, many therapy training programs now provide training in cultural sensitivity and recruit members of underrepresented cultural groups. Another area of potential value conflict is religion. Highly religious people may prefer and benefit from religiously similar therapists. They may have trouble establishing an emotional bond with a therapist who does not share their values. For those thinking about seeking therapy, Close Up, A Consumer's Guide to Psychotherapists, offers some tips on when to seek help and how to start searching for a therapist who shares your perspective and goals. Albert Ellis, who advocated an aggressive rational emotive therapy, and Alan Bergen, co-editor of the Handbook of Psychotherapy and Behavior Change, illustrated how sharply therapists can differ, and how those differences can affect their view of a healthy person. Ellis assumed that no one and nothing is supreme, that self-gratification should be encouraged, and that unequivocal love, commitment, service, and fidelity to any interpersonal commitment, especially marriage, leads to harmful consequences. Bergen assumed the opposite, that because God is supreme, humility and the acceptance of divine authority are virtues, that self-control and committed love and self-sacrifice are to be encouraged, and that infidelity to any interpersonal commitment, especially marriage, leads to harmful consequences. Bergen and Ellis disagreed more radically than most therapists on what values are healthiest. In so doing, however, they agreed on a more general point. Psychotherapists' personal beliefs influence their practice. Because clients tend to adopt their therapist's values, some psychologists believe therapists should divulge those values more openly. The biomedical therapies. Psychotherapy is one way to treat psychological disorders. The other, often used with serious disorders, is biomedical therapy, physically changing the brain's functioning by altering its chemistry with drugs or affecting its circuitry with electroconvulsive shock, magnetic impulses, or psychosurgery. Psychologists can provide psychological therapies, but with a few exceptions, only psychiatrists, as medical doctors, offer biomedical therapies. Drug therapies. By far the most widely used biomedical treatments today are the drug therapies. Since the 1950s, discoveries in psychopharmacology, the study of drug effects on mind and behavior, have revolutionized the treatment of people with severe disorders, liberating hundreds of thousands from hospital confinement. Thanks to drug therapy and to efforts to minimize involuntary hospitalization and to support people with community mental health programs, the resident population of U.S. state and county mental hospitals is a small fraction of what it was a half-century ago. For some unable to care for themselves, however, release from hospitals has meant homelessness, not liberation. Almost any new treatment, including drug therapy, is greeted by an initial wave of enthusiasm as many people apparently improve. But that enthusiasm often diminishes after researchers subtract the rates of 1. Normal recovery among untreated persons, and 2. Recovery due to the placebo effect, which arises from the positive expectations of patients and mental health workers alike. So, to evaluate the effectiveness of any new drug, researchers give half the patients the drug and the other half a similar appearing placebo. Because neither the staff nor the patients know who gets which, this is called a double-blind procedure. The good news? In double-blind studies, several types of drugs have proven useful in treating psychological disorders. Antipsychotic drugs. The revolution in drug therapy for psychological disorders began with the accidental discovery that certain drugs, used for other medical purposes, calmed patients with psychoses, disorders in which hallucinations or delusions indicate some loss of contact with reality. These antipsychotic drugs, such as chlorpromazine, sold as Thorazine, dampened responsiveness to irrelevant stimuli. Thus, they provided the most help to patients experiencing positive symptoms of schizophrenia, such as auditory hallucinations and paranoia. The molecules of most conventional antipsychotic drugs are similar enough to molecules of the neurotransmitter dopamine to occupy its receptor sites and block its activity. This finding reinforces the idea that an overactive dopamine system contributes to the schizophrenia. Antipsychotics are powerful drugs. Some can produce sluggishness, tremors, and twitches similar to those of Parkinson's disease, which is marked by too little dopamine. Long-term use of these medications can also produce tardive dyskinesia, with involuntary movements of the facial muscles, such as grimacing, tongue, and limbs. Patients exhibiting the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, such as apathy and withdrawal, often do not respond well to conventional antipsychotics. Newer atypical antipsychotics, such as clozapine, marketed since 1989 as Clozaril, target both dopamine and serotonin receptors. This helps alleviate negative symptoms, sometimes enabling awakenings in these individuals. Atypical antipsychotics may also help those who have positive symptoms, but have not responded to other drugs. Although not more effective in controlling schizophrenia symptoms, many of the newer antipsychotics have fewer conventional side effects, but they may increase the risk of obesity and diabetes. One new drug now undergoing testing stimulates receptors for the amino acid called glutamate. An initial trial has raised hopes that it may reduce schizophrenia symptoms with fewer side effects. Despite the drawbacks, antipsychotic drugs, combined with the life skills programs and family support, have enabled hundreds of thousands of people with schizophrenia who had been consigned to the back wards of mental hospitals to return to work and to near normal lives. Anti-anxiety drugs. Like alcohol, anti-anxiety drugs such as Xanax or Ativan depress central nervous system activity and so should not be used in combination with alcohol. Anti-anxiety drugs are often used in combination with psychological therapy. A new anti-anxiety drug, the antibiotic D-cycloserine, acts upon a receptor that facilitates the extinction of learned fears. Experiments indicate that the drug enhances the benefits of exposure therapy and helps relieve the symptoms of PTSD and obsessive-compulsive disorder. A criticism sometimes made of the behavior therapies, that they reduce symptoms without resolving underlying problems, is also made of anti-anxiety drugs. Unlike the behavior therapies, however, these substances may be used as an ongoing treatment. Popping a Xanax at the first sign of tension can produce psychological dependence. The immediate relief reinforces a person's tendency to take drugs when anxious. Anti-anxiety drugs can also cause physiological dependence. After heavy use, people who stop taking them may experience increased anxiety, insomnia, and other withdrawal symptoms. Over the dozen years at the end of the 20th century, the rate of outpatient treatment for anxiety disorders nearly doubled. The proportion of psychiatric patients receiving medication during that time increased from 52 to 70%. And the new standard drug treatment for anxiety disorders? Antidepressants. Antidepressant drugs. The antidepressants were named for their ability to lift people up from a state of depression, and this was their main use until recently. The label is a bit of a misnomer now that these drugs are increasingly being used to successfully treat anxiety disorders, such as obsessive-compulsive disorder. They work by increasing the availability of norepinephrine or serotonin, neurotransmitters that elevate arousal and mood and appear scarce during depression. Fluoxetine, which tens of millions of users worldwide have known as Prozac, partially blocks the reabsorption and removal of serotonin from synapses. Because they slow the synaptic vacuuming up of serotonin, Prozac and its cousins Zoloft and Paxil are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. Other antidepressants work by blocking the reabsorption or breakdown of both norepinephrine and serotonin. Though effective, these dual-action drugs have more potential side effects such as dry mouth, weight gain, hypertension, or dizzy spells. Administering them by means of a patch, bypassing the intestines and liver, helps reduce such side effects. After the introduction of SSRI drugs, the percentage of patients receiving medication for depression jumped dramatically, from 70% in 1987, the year before SSRIs were introduced, to 89% in 2001. In the United States, 11% of women and 5% of men take antidepressants. Be advised, patients with depression who begin taking antidepressants do not wake up the next day singing, "It's a beautiful day." Although the drugs begin to influence neurotransmission within hours, their full psychological effect often requires 4 weeks and may involve a side effect of diminished sexual desire. One possible reason for the delay is that increased serotonin promotes neurogenesis, the birth of new brain cells, perhaps reversing stress-induced loss of neurons. Antidepressant drugs are not the only way to give the body a lift. Aerobic exercise, which helps calm people who feel anxious and energize those who feel depressed, does about as much good for some people with mild to moderate depression, and has additional positive side effects. More on this topic later in this unit. Cognitive therapy, by helping people reverse their habitual negative thinking style, can boost the drug-aided relief from depression and reduce the post-treatment risk of relapse. Better yet, some studies suggest is to attack depression from both above and below. Use antidepressant drugs, which work bottom-up on the emotion-forming limbic system, in conjunction with cognitive behavioral therapy, which works top-down, starting with changed frontal lobe activity. Researchers generally agree that people with depression often improve after a month on antidepressants. But after allowing for natural recovery, the return to normal, called spontaneous recovery, and the placebo effect, how big is the drug effect? Not big, report Irving Kirsch and his colleagues. Their analyses of double-blind clinical trials indicate that placebos accounted for about 75% of the active drug's effect. In a follow-up review that included unpublished clinical trials, the antidepressant drug effect was again modest. The placebo effect was less for those with severe depression, which made the added benefits of the drug somewhat greater for them. Given these results, there seems little reason to prescribe antidepressant medication to any but the most severely depressed patients, unless alternative treatments have failed, Kirsch concluded. For about 1 in 4 people who do not respond to a particular antidepressant, switching to another does not bring relief. Scientists dream of a not-too-far-off day when patients may be screened for genetic variations that will indicate drugs to use or avoid. Although the effects of drug therapy are less exciting than many TV ads suggest, they also are less frightening than other stories have warned. Some people taking Prozac, for example, have committed suicide, but their numbers seem fewer than we would expect from the millions of depressed people now taking that medication. Moreover, a large British study revealed that the ups and downs of adolescent SSRI prescriptions over time were unrelated to the adolescent suicide rate. Prozac users who commit suicide are like cell phone users who get brain cancer. Given the millions of people taking Prozac and using cell phones, alarming anecdotes tell us nothing. The question critical thinkers want answered is this: do these groups suffer an elevated rate of suicide and brain cancer? The answer in each case appears to be no. Some researchers have speculated that the start of drug therapy may give formerly inert people enough energy to act on their depression, which could make for a temporary heightened suicide risk. But 3 recent studies of between 70,000 and 439,000 patients concur that, in the long run, patients attempt fewer suicides if treated with antidepressants. Mood-stabilizing medications. In addition to antipsychotic, anti-anxiety, and antidepressant drugs, psychiatrists have mood-stabilizing drugs in their arsenal. The simple salt lithium can be an effective mood stabilizer for those suffering the emotional highs and lows of bipolar disorder. Australian physician John Cade discovered this in the 1940s when he administered lithium to a patient with severe mania. Although Cade's reasoning was misguided, he thought lithium had calmed excitable guinea pigs when actually it had made them sick. His patient became perfectly well in less than a week. After suffering mood swings for years, about 7 in 10 people with bipolar disorder benefit from a long-term daily dose of this cheap salt. Their risk of suicide is but 1/6 that of bipolar patients not taking lithium. Although we do not fully understand why, lithium works. And so does Depakote, a drug originally used to treat epilepsy and more recently found effective in the control of manic episodes associated with bipolar disorder. Brain stimulation. Electroconvulsive therapy. A more controversial brain manipulation occurs through shock treatment or electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. When ECT was first introduced in 1938, the wide-awake patient was strapped to a table and jolted with roughly 100 volts of electricity to the brain, producing racking convulsions and brief unconsciousness. ECT therefore gained a barbaric image, one that lingers. Today, however, the patient receives a general anesthetic and a muscle relaxant to prevent an injury from convulsions, before a psychiatrist delivers 30 to 60 seconds of electrical current to the patient's brain. Within 30 minutes, the patient awakens and remembers nothing of the treatment or of the preceding hours. After 3 such sessions each week for 2 to 4 weeks, 80% or more of people receiving ECT improved markedly, showing some memory loss for the treatment period but no discernible brain damage. Study after study confirms that ECT is an effective treatment for severe depression in patients who have not responded to drug therapy. A leading medical journal concluded that the results of ECT in treating severe depression are among the most positive treatment effects in all of medicine. How does ECT alleviate severe depression? After more than 50 years, no one knows for sure. One recipient likened ECT to the smallpox vaccine, which was saving lives before we knew how it worked. It's also like restarting your computer, which solves many a problem even if you don't know why. Perhaps the shock-induced seizures calm neural centers where overactivity produces depression. ECT, like antidepressant drugs and exercise, also appear to boost the production of new brain cells. ECT reduces suicidal thoughts and is credited with saving many from suicide. It is now administered with briefer pulses, sometimes only to the brain's right side and with less memory disruption. Yet no matter how impressive the results, the idea of electrically shocking people into convulsions still strikes many as barbaric, especially given our ignorance about why ECT works. Moreover, about 4 in 10 ECT-treated patients relapse into depression within 6 months. Nevertheless, in the minds of many psychiatrists and patients, ECT is a lesser evil than severe depression's misery, anguish, and risk of suicide. As research psychologist Norman Endler reported after ECT alleviated his deep depression, a miracle had happened in 2 weeks. Alternative neurostimulation therapies. Some patients with chronic depression have found relief through a chest implant that intermittently stimulates the vagus nerve, which sends signals to the brain's mood-related limbic system. The 2 other techniques, magnetic stimulation and deep brain stimulation, are also raising hopes for more gentler alternatives that jumpstart neural circuits in the depressed brain. Magnetic stimulation. Depressed moods seem to improve when repeated pulses surge through a magnetic coil held close to a person's skull. Unlike deep brain stimulation, the magnetic energy penetrates only to the brain's surface, though tests are underway with a higher energy field that penetrates more deeply. The painless procedure, called repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, RTMS, is performed on wide-awake patients over several weeks. Unlike ECT, the RTMS procedure produces no seizures, memory loss, or other side effects. In one double-blind experiment, 67 Israelis with major depression were randomly assigned to 2 groups. One group received RTMS daily for 2 weeks, while the other received sham treatments, without magnetic stimulation. At the end of the 2 weeks, half the stimulated patients showed at least a 50% improvement in their scores on a depression scale, as did only a quarter of the placebo group. One possible explanation is that the stimulation energizes depressed depressed patient's relatively inactive left frontal lobe. When repeatedly stimulated, nerve cells can form functioning circuits through long-term potentiation, a process described in Unit 7A. Other clinical experiments have had mixed results. Some have found little effects from rTMS treatment. However, several recent studies using the latest techniques have produced significant relief from depression, as compared with sham treatments. Deep brain stimulation. Other patients whose depression has resisted both drugs that flood the body and ECT that jolts at least half the brain have benefited from an experimental treatment pinpointed at a brain depression center. Neuroscientist Helen Mayberg and her colleagues have been focusing on a cortex area that bridges the thinking frontal lobes to the limbic system. They have discovered that this area, which is overactive in the brain of a depressed or temporarily sad person, becomes calm when treated by ECT or antidepressants. To experimentally excite neurons that inhibit this negative emotion feeding activity, Mayberg drew upon the deep brain stimulation technology sometimes used to treat Parkinson's tremors. Among an initial 12 patients receiving implanted electrodes in a pacemaker stimulator, 8 experienced relief. Some felt suddenly more aware and became more talkative and engaged. Others improved only slightly, if at all. Future research will explore whether Mayberg has discovered a switch that can lift depression. Other researchers are following up on reports that deep brain stimulation can offer relief to people with obsessive-compulsive disorder. Psychosurgery. Because its effects are irreversible, psychosurgery, surgery that removes or destroys brain tissue, is the most drastic and the least used biomedical intervention for changing behavior. In the 1930s, Portuguese physician Egas Moniz developed what became the best-known psychosurgical operation, the lobotomy. Moniz found that cutting the nerves connecting the frontal lobes with the emotion-controlling centers of the inner brain calmed uncontrollably emotional and violent patients. In a crude but easy and inexpensive procedure that took only about 10 minutes, a neurosurgeon would shock the patient into a coma, hammer an ice pick-like instrument through each eye socket into the brain, and then wiggle it to sever connections running up to the frontal lobes. Tens of thousands of severely disturbed people, including President John F. Kennedy's sister, Rosemary, were lobotomized between 1936 and 1954, and Moniz was honored with a Nobel Prize. Although the intention was simply to disconnect emotion from thought, a lobotomy's effect was often more drastic. It usually decreased the person's misery or tension, but also produced a permanently lethargic, immature, uncreative person. During the 1950s, after some 35,000 people had been lobotomized in the United States alone, calming drugs became available and psychosurgery was largely abandoned. Today, lobotomies are history, and other psychosurgery is used only in extreme cases. For example, if a patient suffers uncontrollable seizures, surgeons can deactivate the specific nerve clusters that cause or transmit the convulsions. MRI-guided precision surgery is also occasionally done to cut the circuits involved in severe obsessive-compulsive disorder. Because these procedures are irreversible, however, neurosurgeons perform them only as a last resort. Therapeutic lifestyle change. The effectiveness of the biomedical therapies remind us of a fundamental lesson. We find it convenient to talk of separate psychological and biological influences, but everything psychological is also biological. Every thought and feeling depends on the functioning brain. Every creative idea, every moment of joy or anger, every period of depression emerges from the electrochemical activity of the living brain. The influence is two-way. When psychotherapy relieves obsessive-compulsive disorder, PET scans reveal a calmer brain. Anxiety disorders, major depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia are all biological events. As we have seen over and over again, a human being is an integrated biopsychosocial system. For years, we have trusted our bodies to physicians and our minds to psychiatrists and psychologists. That neat separation no longer seems valid. Stress affects body chemistry and health. And chemical imbalances, whatever their cause, can produce schizophrenia and depression. That lesson is being applied by Stephen Ilardi and his colleagues in their training seminars promoting therapeutic lifestyle change. Human brains and bodies were designed for physical activity and social engagement. They note, our ancestors hunted, gathered, and built in groups with little evidence of disabling depression. Indeed, those whose way of life entails strenuous physical activity, strong community ties, sunlight exposure, and plenty of sleep, think of foraging bands in Papua New Guinea or Amish farming communities in North Americas, rarely experience depression. Simply put, humans were never designed for the sedentary, disengaged, socially isolated, poorly nourished, sleep-deprived pace of 21st century American life. The Ilardi team was impressed by this research showing that regular aerobic exercise and a complete night's sleep boost mood and energy. So they invited small groups of people with depression to undergo a 12-week training program with the following goals. 1. Aerobic exercise. 30 minutes a day, at least 3 times weekly. Increases fitness and vitality, stimulates endorphins. 2. Adequate sleep. With a goal of 7 to 8 hours a night. Increases energy and alertness, boosts immunity. 3. Light exposure. At least 30 minutes each morning with a light box. Amplifies arousal and influences hormones. 4. Social connection. With less alone time and at least 2 meaningful social engagements weekly, satisfying the human need to belong. 5. Anti-rumination. By identifying and redirecting negative thoughts, enhancing positive thinking. And 6. Nutritional supplements, including a daily fish oil supplement with omega-3 fatty acids for healthy brain functioning. In one study of 74 people, 77% of those who completed the program experienced relief from depressive symptoms, compared with a 19% rate in those assigned to a treatment as usual control condition. Future research will seek to replicate this striking result of lifestyle change, and also to identify which of the treatment components, additively or in some combination, produce the therapeutic effect. But there seems little reason to doubt the truth of the Latin adage, mens sana in corpore sano, a healthy mind in a healthy body. Preventing psychological disorders. If lifestyle change can help reverse some of the symptoms of psychological disorders, might such change also prevent some disorders from building individuals' resilience and ability to cope with stress and recover from adversity? Faced with unforeseen trauma, most adults exhibit resilience. This was true of New Yorkers in the aftermath of 9/11, especially those who enjoyed supportive close relationships and who had not recently experienced other stressful events. Many psychological disorders are understandable responses to a disturbing and stressful society. We have seen that psychotherapies and biomedical therapies tend to locate the cause of psychological disorders within the person with the disorder. These therapies try to treat people by giving them insight into their problems, by changing their thinking, or by helping them gain control with drugs. Yet, according to the preventive view, it is not just the person who needs treatment, but also the person's social context. Better to prevent a problem by reforming a sick situation and by developing people's coping competencies than to wait for a problem to arise and then treat it. A story about the rescue of a drowning person from a rushing river illustrates this viewpoint. Having successfully administered first aid to the first victim, the rescuer spots another struggling person and pulls her out too. After a half dozen repetitions, the rescuer suddenly turns and starts running away while the river sweeps yet another floundering person into view. "Aren't you going to rescue that fellow?" asks a bystander. "Heck no," the rescuer replies. "I'm going upstream to find what's pushing all these people in." Preventative mental health is upstream work. It seeks to prevent psychological casualties by identifying and alleviating the conditions that cause them. As George Albee pointed out, there is abundant evidence that poverty, meaningless work, constant criticism, unemployment, racism, and sexism undermine people's sense of competence, personal control, and self-esteem. Such stresses increase their risk of depression, alcohol dependency, and suicide. We who care about preventing psychological casualties should, Albee contended, support programs that alleviate these demoralizing situations. We eliminated smallpox not by treating the afflicted, but by inoculating the unafflicted. We conquered yellow fever in many parts of the world by controlling mosquitoes. Preventing psychological problems means empowering those who have learned an attitude of helplessness, changing environments that breed loneliness, renewing the disintegrating family, and bolstering parents' and teachers' skills at nurturing children's achievements and resulting self-esteem. Indeed, everything aimed at improving the human condition, at making life more fulfilling and meaningful, may be considered part of primary prevention of mental or emotional disturbances. That includes the cognitive training that promotes positive thinking in children at risk for depression.